We're pretty lucky to have Drew. He travels the world really and gives a lot of great talks on multiple topics. Tonight he's going to hit on some work that he's done here. Andrew Pickens, you did your PhD work here. He also belongs to a local hunt club adjacent to the forest, so he's on these forests a lot. And so Drew, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Helen. Good evening, everyone. Man, it's like a little bit of a faculty meeting. Hey, Ricky, how you doing? Thank you, Helen, for having me here today. And, I think in the vein of a learning environment, I've got a lot of slides here to talk about a lot. And one of the things a mentor taught me years ago, there are two ways to go with statistics. You can know a little about a lot or a lot about a little. All right, I'll let you decide what that is today. But what I'm going to try to do is, first of all, to give a little bit of a primer, hopefully, in sort of birds and forestry, as it were. As Helen said, I cut my teeth really on this forest, on the Andrew Pickens, with my PhD studying birds here. And then have had several students, Curtis Walker, one of them, Julia Camp, another, who've worked in various lands, both Forest Service and South Carolina DNR lands. But then I grew up in the middle of the Long Cane district down in Edgefield. So I think I'm pretty well acquainted, if nothing else, with the Sumter district. So we'll go forward here. So there's a question that people often ask: why manage for songbirds? Now, you'll see me include a couple of other birds in here that aren't songbirds. You'll see me include things like bobwhite quail, things like ruffed grouse. And as I include those birds, we're going to think about this whole community. So even though this study that you'll see that I present, that Curtis Walker, MS student, did over in the Jocassee Gorges, relating fire and birds, we'll move on a little bit from that. They use a variety of habitats, obviously, but they provide all of these different things. I mean, they're pretty to look at, but then they're also barometers of our environment. And often you will see not only are they barometers of our environment, but folks will use them as indicator species. Now, there's good and bad in using single species as indicator species. We can argue and discuss and talk about that a little bit. But South Carolina is unique in for being a small state, 43rd in size, for having this amazing bird diversity. Now, a lot of that focus on bird diversity gets pushed down into the low country, down into the coastal zones, because there's all that standing water around there. It's easier to see birds. And not only is that where a lot of the attention goes, but it's where a lot of the money goes. People are pretty eager to fund bird work down on the coast. Let me tell you, it's a lot harder to get bird work funded up here, even though it's sorely, sorely needed. So the first bird I'll jump off on is ruffed grouse. It's always been amazing to me that there's a hunting season on those birds and people really don't know what they're doing here. Or golden-winged warblers. That's another bird that we can talk about. So the upstate and the mountain region in particular, South Carolina has the tiny sliver of that ecoregion, but not very much of it in terms of how we think about what happens with birds and forests here. So a lot of this you've seen, right, in understanding what South Carolina's forests are, but I put this up for us to begin to understand in the discussion that we ultimately have to have about public lands. All right, this is not Wyoming, this is not Colorado, this is a southeastern state with a tiny sliver of public lands really related to our land base. And that tiny sliver of public land is a blessing and a curse. For one thing, people expect everything out of that public land. And it's just not going to happen. So there are decisions that have to be made. Now, the burden for bird conservation in our state really is on private lands. But yet again, it shifts to our public lands because of expectation. So I'm going to scoot through a little bit of this. And this is where we are, right? We're at the edge of the world as far as the Southern Appalachians are concerned. Now, folks in Georgia and Alabama would argue with you about that, but this portion of the escarpment, as we've learned earlier, is different. It really is quite different. So some of the birds that occur here, things like this peregrine falcon or this black-throated blue warbler, these birds are at the edge. And so when you're at the edge of your literal existence, at the edge of your range map, there are other stressors that come in to play. So literally in these mountains, you can go on one side at an elevation right around 2,000 feet and you're going to find black-throated blue warblers. Drop down what you think is imperceptibly in elevation and they ain't there in what looks like the same habitat. All right, one cove will be thick with Swainson's warblers, the next cove will not. So there are a lot of these sort of microsite differences that happen here in our mountains that impact the birds. And because these microsite differences are sort of hard to pull out, our management can also affect those pretty dramatically. Now, I'm bringing in the Piedmont a little bit because, again, we're at the edge of the world. So part of what happens because we're at the edge of the world is we figure, wow, well, we need to have that here too. All right, so there's a lot of concern now for grassland species. There's an initiative out of Austin Peay, the Southeast Grasslands Initiative. How many folks have heard of that? It's a big deal. It's a pretty big deal and growing. And part of that grasslands initiative is understanding where grasslands were and where possibly they should be. So some of these grasslands we think about occurring in the mountains. Now, primarily when we think about grasslands and mountains, what are we thinking about? Balls, right? How many balls do we have in South Carolina? We don't. All right, we got cheated elevationally, but we did. But we began to think about some of these places in these anthropogenic habitats, so power line rights of ways and the like. So what I teach students is, and what wildlife is about, Dr. Davis, I'm sure will tell you, anybody else in here is a wildlife ecologist, it's sort of a field of dreams, right? But it's not as definitive as baseball players stepping out of a cornfield. It really is built sort of on a wing and a prayer. You can do the best that you think you're doing and the birds never show up. Ask bobwhite quail. Lots of money's been spent on bobwhite quail and pineland restoration. You know, whole districts down on the long cane, lots of compartments that have been shifted really in that direction, and quail really aren't doing that much better down there. So this multiplicity of factors that affects birds affects this paradigm of the field of dreams. So we've got all of these challenges in South Carolina, all of these challenges that affect how we manage birds, how we produce these fields of dreams. What are our challenges here? What are our challenges in the mountains of South Carolina? What are our challenges specifically on public lands? You know what those challenges on public lands are? Multiple use philosophy, right? Multiple use philosophy. But then, beyond multiple use philosophy, what is it? We want to try to manage every acre for every species, and we know that we can't do that. So those challenges are real, especially, again, and I brought it up from the beginning, for thin slivers of public land relative to these large tracts of public land. So I want us to begin to think not just about that public land as some sort of island. How is that public land interacting with the private lands around it? Again, I'm on Buzzard Roost Hunt Club, right down on Bush Creek Road in Walhalla, South Carolina. And I'll tell you what, there is no fence that keeps stuff from happening from my hunt club versus Buzzard Roost Heritage Preserve. There's not a fence there. So it's an ecological unit, if you want to think of it like that, at least a management unit. So thinking again about these challenges for bird conservation, every time we think of a challenge, I want us to begin to think about solutions for the challenge. So if I'm limited in area, how do I move that scope outward? How do I enlarge public land? How do I enlarge good for birds? And because we live in a small southeastern state with a lot of expectations on tiny slivers of land, we have to expand that demand outward. So here are some of the conservation challenges that we have to think about for all wildlife. but especially for birds. Some of these birds, I want you to think about a handful of paper clips. A warbler not weighing much more than a couple of grams, right? And that bird would require a couple of 100 hectares for a breeding pair to be successful. So that puts the fear of God into people when they start talking about things like cerulean warblers. And they're like, oh my God, now I've got to set aside 1,000 acres for cerulean warblers. But we have to think about context, continuity, composition, and then the management objectives. And so as we began to talk about restoration, my first question with restoration is always set point. Always want to understand what set point is. So what is that set point? Well, a lot of people would say it's 1491. Well, you got a lot of dam busting to do. You got a lot of people that got to go. And then you got a lot of burning to do. All right? Because when we began to think about this landscape, you know, there's a little bit of hubris in what modern humans have done. When I say modern, current humans have done. As if peoples before us did not have the intelligence to change their lands to suit what they wanted. So that whole myth of forest primeval, from the Atlantic to the prairie, of squirrels being able to run to the treetops, really culturally sort of take some respect from those people who were changing their landscapes mightily. And so when you begin to look at early explorers' records of birds, the birds that they were seeing were indicative of more open habitats. Not that the coves weren't thick, not that they weren't seeing some of those deep forest birds, but perhaps a different landscape than we think about. So, large tracts of land, size matters. Now, part of this that you see down here, and again, in sort of full disclosure, I did my dissertation on early successional songbirds, but it began as a dissertation looking for tracts of old growth here in the Andrew Pickens, and trying to use the model that Scott Robinson was using in the Midwest and trying to transport it to the Southeast. In the islands, I figured out one day as I was in a sort of a deep depression because the data just wasn't working. I was standing in a clear cut and I figured out those clear cuts were the islands, and began to ask questions about those early successional species that people were asking about mature forest species. And what I discovered was, in part, that the early successional species that occur up here in these mountains, some of them, not all of them, some of them require patches, generally patches larger than about 5 acres. So a prairie warbler, for example, you know, for a prairie warbler, a patch that's an acre or 2 is just a gap. And it typically won't settle in it. And if it does, it typically isn't successful there as a breeder. So connecting the dots is important. So size, context, connecting the dots. Remember, think about those dot connectors as how we come from simply having slivers of public land to larger tracts. Seasons, species, and situations. This is critical, again, because if people are saying, well, we want to conserve birds in the mountains of South Carolina. Well, which birds? What bird? Now imagine, and I will tell you, I had this fantasy as Curtis was doing his work, because as we're working on, as Mark Hall, everybody knows Mark, right? As Mark Hall is burning in Jocassee and we're looking at trying to restore Table Mountain pine and those oak pine heath communities. And I remember one day I asked Mark as he was out, and I think Mark, as infamously, had 1 or 2 people with him. And Mark told me the way that he burned was Benadryl and a Budweiser at night. I always use that. We had dreams that could happen. That the Jocassee Gorges would one day be a place where that bird might occur. But really, people don't want red cockaded woodpeckers in Jocassee, do they? But some of these other birds we might be able to live with. So species considerations, and those species considerations are linked silviculturally to what happens here. So what we do on the landscape, All right, again, what people have always done in changing the lands on which they live, we do it at a very different intensity. All right, so time, aerial scale, all of those are different. So even age treatments like clear cuts that are sort of diagrammically presented here and seed tree treatments impact the birds that exist there. So these species, prairie warblers and blue grosbeaks and yellow-breasted chats and eastern towhees, those are birds that want to be in a relatively large clear cut, generally bigger than about 5 acres, especially in years up here, depending on site index, but really want to be in that site. They really start moving in about year 2 through year 8 to 10. And then that forest becomes so thick that then they move on. Now, I will tell you that all of these birds are rapidly declining species. So people would think, oh my God, there are clear cuts everywhere. These birds are everywhere. They are not. So rapidly declining species, early successional species. Shelter woods. Okay, we come between, and when we think about even age treatments versus uneven age treatments, shelter woods are sort of the midland, as it were. And you see more canopy coverage left there, more volume left there. And really those shelter woods provide the opportunity for more of what we would call woodland species. Those birds then that would want some canopy cover, but really not as much understory. Now, the amount of understory that you have depends upon intermediate treatments, including what? Fire. So anybody who hunts turkeys knows that they like to see, right? They like to have a relatively clear understory. Birds like summer tanagers and eastern wood-pewees also like these sort of open park-like settings. So silviculturally speaking, shelter woods are one of the ways that we get there. And again, that is site dependent, but also dependent upon the tree species that we're trying to cultivate. Go low country, and those are the birds that tend to be there, but the little GIF here is of a fire. So in the low country, in shelter woods and woodland systems, it's easy for us to consider fire, and it's easy for us to link that fire to longleaf pine and other yellow pine species. You know, as a student of Dr. Dave Van Leer, one of the things that Dr. Van Leer had to endure about mid-career and late in his career was Dr. Van Leer really wanted fire in hardwoods. And man, that didn't always go over well. But you do some of this research and you understand the silvics of some of these trees, and I'm sure Dr. Hagen can tell you that it is not absent in those systems. So then we come to what a lot of people expect here in the mountains. A lot of lighter treatments. So we began to talk about uneven age management, single tree and group tree selection. So when we look at those stands for uneven age management, if you take a quick glimpse at those stands, there doesn't appear to be any difference. And so one of the expectations on public lands is that there is no change. Some people have an expectation that the hand of forestry will render no change to those lands. And in some places that's the case. When we're talking about a preservation stand, or we're talking about a stand where, for example, it's over mature or old growth, and we're saying, you know what, we're going to let natural senescence have its place in those stands. But this is what many folks would expect here. And these are the birds that sort of pop out. Things like scarlet tanagers and wood thrush and red-eyed vireos and even ovenbirds. Mature forest, many of these birds, neotropical migrants, birds that are now migrating this fall back down to the neotropics, to the Central American highlands, for example, was where a scarlet tanager would be going. And in bottomlands, things like Kentucky warblers and northern parula's and Louisiana water thrush. So the colors are a little bit off here, but what I want you to see here is sort of these guild gradients. I want you to see that some birds are really tightly tied to silvicultural treatments or forest conditions. So again, you heard me talk about a prairie warbler being tied to a forest stand maybe for only 5, 6, or 7 years. Then it's got to find the next patch. On the other hand, you've got birds like a hooded warbler in a mature forest who might be able to come back time and time again and not find a stasis, right? But that mature forest that has changed less dramatically than early successional habitat has. So there's this gradient, obviously, and you can think about these extremes. All right, so these are sort of forest management commandments that I give students. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes, okay. So I'm going to go down here, and I want to show you a little bit of Curtis's study because I think it's important from a Jocassee Gorges standpoint for us to see these connections to birds and fire. So science on the ground and trying to understand how things have happened. So consequences of the fire suppression that you see in Jocassee Gorges are hardwood intrusion, quite frankly, in some areas. And we also see frequently these ericaceous species creeping upslope. All right, makes a nice Sierra Club calendar, but ecologically it's probably not where these things are supposed to be. So these early successional songbirds, I gave you this data before in thinking about how these birds are faring. And when you see here that grassland birds are declining at really scary, alarming rates, shrub, scrub, those early successional species declining, and then the number of woodland and interior species that are increasing and decreasing, they're almost the same. So that tells us something about the landscapes in which we exist. So the problems, one of those, and one of the things that we're here to discuss tonight is this lack of attention to these birds, this lack of attention that we've had to fire, or a different sort of attention, I would like to say. So we did these comparisons between these ridgetop forests that Mark was burning for Table Mountain pine restoration, for shortleaf pine restoration, and to understand how those things were impacting birds. So Jocassee Gorges is the study site. We selected these sites. When we're talking about bird studies, it's difficult to select sites that give us clean statistical comparisons. All right, it's not an experimental lab out there per se, and so trying to find the best plots back in 2010 and 2011 to use it was a difficult proposition. So I'll get through a little bit of this. That's all the sort of the statistics there. But it's important to see here, so when we look at slopes and percent pine and herbaceous cover, we're looking for eastern wood-pewees. We're looking at percent pine being, for example, positively associated with those birds. Ovenbirds, DBH, all right, so mature forest, big trees, and canopy height. Now remember what I was showing you before sort of stylistically and sort of these graphs and what birds prefer. So back here, this is a woodland bird. Loves open understory, tall trees, woodland settings. This is a mesic hardwood bird. This is Frost's bird, his early midwood bird. So this is a bird that likes mesic hardwoods. Worm-eating warblers love ericaceous shrubs. If you want to find these birds this time of year as they're migrating through, you'll find them in sort of the curled up, browning rhododendron leaves looking for insects. Here's a bird with treatment effect. What was the treatment? Again, fire. And a bird whose association with fire is seen, at least in the numbers of birds that we recorded in burn plots versus non-burn plots, to be negatively associated. A bird associated with snags, not a woodpecker, but a bird that gleans bark. Black-throated green warbler, Again, a bird showing treatment effect. So this is a bird with a negative association with fire. So consistently higher index values for sites impacted by fire. So the diversity indices tended to be higher in those sites that were impacted by fire. But there was this year effect. And unless you're studying these plots for extraordinarily long periods of time, and most master's students don't want to stick around for a decade, it's hard to tease out some of these effects. The science in this is hardly ever clean. It's part of the reason when you hear me talk about the attention here to birds versus elsewhere, we need long-term studies to help us understand what's going on. We need drum counts for ruffed grouse. We need to understand that after those initial impacts to hooded warblers, how do they respond 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later? There again is the Wood-Pewee. Again, we're creating woodlands in many of these locations. Mature forest species, the Ovenbird, as I told you. Worm-eating warbler. Declines following fire in part because what the fire does what to those ericaceous shrubs? Tends to knock them back. And it removes a good bit of that leaf litter that this bird forages in. So that's kind of the story. And you can see this diversity of impacts to these different birds. And so again, the take-home message here, again, is what are our expectations? That's always a question. When we're talking about restoration, what are our expectations? What do we expect to see? If you expect to go in 100 acres of land and see all of these birds, then it's not likely to happen. You might have to hike up over the ridge. You might have to go down towards the creek. But understanding diversity of this landscape and the difficulty in sort of typing it bird by bird, but thinking about these communities, if you will, as a moving mosaic. All right, oftentimes we want this idea of a mosaic, of a quilt. Grandma's quilt that stays the same from when she sewed it to when we put it on our feet on a cold night. The quilt that we're dealing with is dynamic. It moves. So thinking about early successional patches of habitat as winking in and out. Thinking about those mature forest habitats that come up, they will eventually senesce. A storm will come through and blow them down. A Kentucky warbler will find that and be like, hey, this is cool for a little bit until it comes back up. So it's a dynamic system. It's an exciting system. I've spent a good portion of my life studying it. I dare say I will spend more of my life studying it. I have pretty much given up turkey hunting because I can't stop watching birds through binoculars. So the two don't go together well in the springtime. So with that said, if we've got time for questions, I'd like to take one or two.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.